This week we'll be talking about the social self, and I want to stress before we begin that the whole concept of the self is really a relatively new idea that really was spurred by Western development, which stresses a much more emphasis on the individual as opposed to considering the community. So we'll start out by talking about one of the early contributors to this whole notion of the social self. William James, you probably remember, was one of the founding fathers of American psychology. And William James thought that there was really no core self that's independent from social relationships. So he came up with this term, the social me, to refer to the parts of self-knowledge that we get from the social relationships that we're in. James recognized that we're not always the same self in every situation. So the self that we present tends to change depending on who we're relating to. And he proposed, and this is a quote by him, "A man has as many social selves as there are individuals who recognize him." So he recognized that we behave differently and present a different sense of self depending on who we're talking to, and that the self does not exist in isolation. And this was over a century ago when James proposed this idea, and he thought that our sense of who we are is really forged by how we interact with other people. It kind of also draws in some of that communal idea of how we think of ourselves. Going much further back in Western history, we know that the great orators like Plato and Aristotle spent a lot of time in what they called introspection. And you probably remember the ancient Greek admonition to know thyself, that you should know thyself. And that implies that self-knowledge can be acquired simply through introspection, quietly looking within, quietly and reflectively looking within. So this is kind of contrary to some of James's ideas about how we really have these several different selves that reflect the relationship that they're connected to. Now, although there are a lot of benefits to quiet introspection or meditation or getting in touch with yourself, there's definitely benefit to that. The reliability of it as a method of really getting to know ourselves has been debated for decades. So that's because it doesn't always yield accurate information. Now, some parts of ourself are going to be clear and we'll be able to get a sense of ourself through introspection. But oftentimes we lack insight into ourselves because we have blinders to certain negative aspects of ourselves that maybe we are more motivated not to know than to know. Also, there are even certain positive attributes that you might have that you are blind to. As a test to this, you might ask someone that really knows you well and that you trust to maybe write out a list of some attributes or characteristics that they associate with you, things that they think are part of your personality, and take a look at them. You might be actually surprised to know some of the positive as well as maybe some of the negative, if they're honest, aspects of you that they see that maybe you aren't that in touch with, but maybe should be. Another thing that interferes with self-knowledge is that many of our mental processes occur outside of our conscious awareness. So we don't oftentimes understand even our own behavior or how that relates to the self. A good example of this uh, was demonstrated through a study where they had people view several different shops. It was, excuse me, several different socks. So it was a shopping experience, like an online shopping experience where they viewed several different pictures of socks. I understand that's quite a thing now with some guys are really into wearing the bright socks. I think it's kind of fun. But at any rate, these people, they asked them to be in this study and go sock shopping. And their job as participants in this study was to simply pick out the sock that they preferred the most, the one that they would like to buy if they had the ability to do that. And the results were that the majority of the participants in the study actually picked the sock, their favorite sock, as the last item that was presented. So statistically, that would be not something that you would expect to come up in a study. You would expect to have the choices randomly kind of dispersed because different people would have different preferences about socks. And they'd be looking for different attributes in socks. And so the conclusion, of course, of the researchers was that people tended to pick the last sock that was shown because it was the most convenient. They didn't have to go back over looking at all of the other socks and compare each one. So that means that these people probably were relying more on convenience than some kind of actual preference. When they asked the people, though, why they picked the last sock, they said that it was actually the one that they preferred. So they really were not in touch with their own motivation about that, or their own likes or dislikes that much. And oftentimes we use these kind of heuristic kind of mental processes because they're convenient, because they're fast, and we don't necessarily have an awareness that that's what's going on. One of the more modern theories about the self was proposed by Dan McAdams in 2008. He calls it the narrated self, or the ongoing story we tell ourselves about our social self. So that includes all of the aspects that you would expect to be included in a drama or a movie or a play, a book. It's composed of characters, including yourself, different themes, different plot twists when something significant happens, a marriage, a birth, a divorce, different images related to your memory, and different scenes. Next, we'll be talking about organization of self-knowledge, and we'll be talking about self-schemas. If you recall what a schema is, we defined it before as a knowledge structure consisting of any organized body of stored information. So it relates to memory, and we also talked about schemas as being kind of organized packets of information that are stored in our memory. So here we have self-schema defined for you: a cognitive structure derived from past experience that represents a person's beliefs and feelings about the self in general and in specific situations. Self-schemas serve as basic units or kind of chunks of information organized around the self for self-knowledge. Some aspects of self-schema for you might include your sense of yourself, your knowledge of yourself as a student. It also could be another aspect, another self-schema could be around your relationships. So you might see yourself as a son or a daughter, a parent, or you might see yourself in terms of your academic careers. Are you a psychology major? Many of you are. You might think of yourself as an introvert or an extrovert, as an athlete or a nerd or a geek, as yourself as a professional, as an employee, as a self in a social setting, out partying with people. So all of those all include aspects of your self-schema, however you think of yourself, and relates to the roles that you play really in life. So where does our sense of self come from? The book talks a lot about how the family is kind of the core of where that begins and how we relate to them. But we're going to be talking about some specific theories that tie into self-knowledge. So Charles Cooley introduced this theory of the looking glass self. This was back in 1902. And the idea of this was that we get a sense of self-knowledge by observing how other people react to us, and they serve as a mirror into ourselves. So if they approve of us, that's going to give us a positive sense of ourselves. If they disapprove of us, then it's going to be more of a negative sense of ourselves. So other people are kind of a mirror into our own self. Self-knowledge is derived, according to Cooley, through what he called reflected self-appraisals. So that is simply our beliefs about what other people think of us. And we tend to rely, this is an interesting theory, because there's, like most theories, there's a lot of truth to that, but it's not always going to be a perfect theory, especially when we know that this is about how we imagine other people react to us. It's not always an accurate representation of who we are, because a lot of times we could misread how someone is experiencing us or misinterpret that. So have you ever thought that maybe someone disliked you and later on found out that that wasn't the case at all, or thought that somebody was ignoring you when maybe they actually were really distracted with some other issue that they were dealing with that didn't relate to you at all? So when I interact with you, I can easily misread however you're acting. So I may think that you're impatient with me, but maybe you're just processing something that has nothing to do with our situation. This is just an image that kind of gives you the idea that, when we look to others to how we look, we might misinterpret things a bit. We'll be talking next about situationism. So situationism, as it relates to our social self, is the idea that our consciousness of who we are can change depending on the situation. It's the idea that the social self changes across different contexts. And so in other words, we behave differently, and so we experience ourselves differently depending on who we're interacting with, if we're interacting with someone or if we're alone. And I see we're running out of time here, so we will pick up looking at working self-concept next time.